Paris. March 12, 1932. Inside a luxury apartment on Avenue Victor Manuel, a single gunshot rings out. It is a sharp, final sound that echoes not just through the building, but through the entire financial spine of the Western world. Lying in the bedroom is a man named Ivar Kreuger. To the public, he is a titan, a savior. The man who is practically holding the global economy together with his bare hands. At the moment that bullet pierced his heart, he was believed to be one of the richest men in history, a man who didn't just own businesses. He owned governments. He had bailed out nations, stabilized currencies, and prevented wars. He was the match king, and the world believed his vaults were overflowing with gold and government bonds. But when the police arrived and finally cracked open his personal safe, they didn't find a fortune. They found ... nothing. It was empty. The man who had bought the world had paid for it with money that never existed. There is a terrifying pattern in history, a specific sequence of events that turns financial genius into global catastrophe. It happens when complexity becomes a disguise for theft, and when the world is so desperate for a hero that they stop asking questions. Ivar Kreuger didn't just commit a crime. He wrote the playbook for every major financial collapse that has happened since. From Enron to FTX, they are all just echoes of the gun that went off in Paris that morning. And the most frightening part? It's the financial system we trust today was built on the very ruins he left behind. To understand how one man could fool the entire planet, we have to go back to the desperate years following World War I. Europe was shattered. The trenches were filled in, but the bank accounts were empty. Germany was drowning in hyperinflation. France was insolvent. Nations from Poland to Greece were begging for capital to rebuild. But the big banks in London and New York were paralyzed by fear. They wouldn't lend a dime. Enter Ivar Kreuger. He was a Swedish engineer, quiet, calm, utterly unflashy. He didn't look like a gambler. He looked like the only sane man in a room full of lunatics. And he had a proposition that was so simple, yet so audacious, it bordered on madness. He wasn't selling oil or steel or weapons. He was selling matches. Wooden safety matches. A product that cost a fraction of a penny. But Kreuger understood something that modern tech giants are only just rediscovering: the power of the monopoly. He went to desperate kings and prime ministers with a suitcase full of cash, millions of dollars raised from eager American investors. He would say, "I will lend your government the money you need to survive. In exchange, you make me the only person allowed to sell matches in your country." It was brilliant. A government-enforced monopoly on a product everyone used every day. On the surface, it seemed like the safest investment in history. But underneath, Kreuger was building a machine that had nothing to do with wood and phosphorus. He was building a financial engine designed to run on trust, smoke, and mirrors. He wasn't just a businessman. He was the architect of the first global too-big-to-fail scheme. And just like today, nobody looked at the foundation until the building began to collapse. By the late 1920s, Ivar Kreuger was more powerful than most heads of state. He controlled nearly 75% of the world's match production. He lent $125 million to Germany, a sum that stabilized the Weimar Republic when no one else could. He bailed out France. He was the sovereign of the seas of finance. American investors, from Wall Street tycoons to average households, poured their life savings into Kreuger and toll securities. The dividends were astronomical: 20, sometimes 30%. It was the sure thing. But here is where the story shifts from success to the dark art of financial alchemy. The math simply didn't work. The profit from selling matches, even with a monopoly, wasn't enough to pay those massive dividends or the interest on the loans he took to bribe governments. A normal business would have lowered the dividends. Kreuger did something else: invented off-balance sheet accounting. This is the turning point. The moment the hero becomes the villain. Kreuger created a labyrinth of over 400 subsidiary companies. Some were in the Netherlands, some in Switzerland, some in Liechtenstein. Most were empty shells, just a mailbox and a name. When Kreuger and Toll lost money, or when he needed to hide debt, he would simply transfer the liability to one of these shadow companies. It was a shell game played at the speed of light. He moved assets between banks so fast that by the time auditors checked the ledger, the money was gone, moved to a different account in a different country. He booked imaginary profits from these shadow companies to pay real dividends to American investors. He was using new investor money to pay off the old investors, the classic definition of a Ponzi scheme. But because he was lending to governments, because he was the match king, nobody dared to call it that. He made finance so complex that people assumed he was a genius because the alternative that he was a fraud was too terrifying to consider. Then came 1929. The Great Depression didn't just break the market, it drained the ocean that Kreuger's ship was floating on. As the global economy froze, liquidity vanished. Investors in New York stopped buying his stocks. They wanted their cash back. Simultaneously, the struggling governments of Europe couldn't repay the loans Kreuger had given them. He was being squeezed from both sides. The flow of new money, the oxygen of a Ponzi scheme, was cut off. The final act of this tragedy is pathetic and desperate. In a last-ditch effort to keep the illusion alive, Kreuger began forging Italian government bonds. He sat in his room, personally forging the signatures, including that of Benito Mussolini, on bonds worth nearly $142 million. He tried to use these crude forgeries as collateral for one last loan. It didn't work. The banks demanded an audit. The whispers started. The walls closed in. And so, on that rainy Saturday in Paris, Ivar Kreuger realized the game was over. He purchased a pistol, lay down on his bed, and checked out. When we strip away the 1920s aesthetic, we can see that Kreuger's rise and fall follows a universal law. It is a pattern that has repeated in every major financial disaster of the last century. There are 4 distinct stages to this cycle, and once you see them, you will see them everywhere. Stage 1 is the monolith. It starts with a legitimate success. Kreuger really did sell matches. Enron really did trade energy. There is a core of truth that builds an unshakable reputation. This stage creates the trust capital that the fraud will later spend. Stage 2 is complexity as camouflage. The entity becomes too difficult to understand. They introduce proprietary metrics, off-balance cheat vehicles, or innovative crypto tokens. This complexity serves a dual purpose. It hides the losses, and it intimidates outsiders. If you ask questions, you are told you just don't understand the new economy. Stage 3 is the liquidity trap. This is the Ponzi moment. The underlying business stops growing, but the lifestyle and the promises remain. To keep the machine running, the entity must consume more cash than it produces. They borrow against future earnings that will never arrive. They use new debt to pay old interest. Becomes a race against time. Stage 4 is the sudden stop. Collapses never happen gradually. They happen all at once. Usually triggered by an external shock, a market crash, a rate hike, or a bank run. The liquidity dries up. The curtain falls, and the audience realizes the theater is on fire. Now, look at the world around us today. Does any of this feel familiar? Fast forward to the early 2000s. Enron, the energy giant, used special-purpose entities, literally the exact same mechanism as Kreuger's shadow companies, to hide billions in debt. They called them Raptors. Kreuger called them Garanta. Different names, same lie. Look closer at the crypto collapse of 2022. FTX and Sam Bankman-Fried. Here was a young, seemingly altruistic genius who was bailing out other failing crypto firms, just as Kreuger bailed out nations. Behind the scenes, customer funds were being funneled through a complex web between the exchange and a hedge fund, Alameda Research. Just like Kreuger, SBF used his reputation and political donations to keep regulators at bay. Stage 1, check. Stage 2, check. But the most disturbing parallel isn't a criminal one, it's structural. Today, the global economy is running on a level of debt that would make Kreuger blush. Governments around the world are borrowing money to pay the interest on money they previously borrowed. We have created financial instruments derivatives, collateralized loan obligations that are so complex, central bankers themselves admit they don't fully understand the systemic risk. We are living in a period of complexity as camouflage. We assume the system works because it hasn't broken yet. We are watching Stage 3 play out in real time on a sovereign level. The reliance on constant expansion, on the assumption that tomorrow will always be richer than today, is the same bet Kreuger made. He bet that the Roaring '20s would never end. We are betting that the debt cycle can go on forever. When the Match King fell, the consequences were not just financial. They were human. The collapse of the Kreuger empire wiped out the life savings of thousands of families. It deepened the Great Depression. In Sweden, the shock was so profound that the prime minister fell from power. The suicide rate in Stockholm spiked. It was a brutal reminder that when we financialize everything, we are linking our survival to the gambling habits of a few men in closed rooms. But there was one positive outcome. The sheer scale of Kreuger's fraud forced the United States to pass the Securities Act of 1933. It created the rules of transparency we have today. Every time a company files a public report, every time an auditor checks a book, it is because of Ivar Kreuger. However, rules are only as good as the people enforcing them. The lesson of history is that innovation in finance is often just a fancy word for finding a new way to hide risk. When the next collapse comes, it won't look like a match monopoly. It will look like a revolutionary technology or a new monetary theory. It will look like the future. And just like in 1932, the fall will be sudden. It will be brutal. And it will be final. Visual slow zoom out from the smoking gun in the Paris hotel room. The screen fades to black, leaving only the Economy Rewind logo. Ivar Kreuger once said, "Silence, and still more silence." That was his secret. He knew that if he kept his mouth shut and looked confident, the world would project its own desires onto him. We are living in a loud world, but the risks are often hiding in the quiet corners of the ledger, in the footnotes that nobody reads. History is a rewind button that we keep pressing, hoping for a different movie, but getting the same ending. Don't let your financial future be part of the collateral damage. If you want to understand the patterns before they play out, make sure you're subscribed to Economy Rewind. We dig into the past to safeguard your future. I'll see you in the next one.